We've been doing an expository survey of the Old Testament, and we have worked our way up to the book of Job. The book of Job receives its title from its main character. The Hebrew word Yov appears in the original Hebrew text, and the English form Job is derived from the Vulgate version. Thus, from the Vulgate, the English form then is taken. As to its author, the author of the book is actually unknown. Job, Elihu, Moses, Solomon, Isaiah, Hezekiah, Baruch, etc. have all been suggested, but none can be established with certainty. It seems most likely that the book was written during the Solomonic era by a pious Jew who was a worshiper of Yahweh and who was led to deal with the problem of the suffering of the righteous. In terms of the date, there are a number of views respecting the date for the composition of the book. First of all, several different ones can be briefly then described, and then the more probable one will be given. First, there are those who date the authorship during the patriarchal period. Since the historical events of the book occurred during the period, it is suggested that the authorship did likewise. This view is supported by the Talmud and others. Various authors then, such as Job, Elihu, and Moses, have been suggested. The problem with this date is that the writing and the composition seems to bear evidence to the period of the wisdom literature rather than to the literature of the patriarchal period. Second, some such as Ewald and Hitzig date its composition in the 7th century BC, shortly after the fall of the northern kingdom. Those who support this view seek to maintain that the questions of providence in Job evidence the fact of a widespread misfortune. The answer to this, however, is that the misfortune in Job is individual and does not seem to evidence any widespread or national misfortune. Only is this found hence in Job himself. Also, the misfortune of the 7th century BC was due to the idolatrous and wrong practices at that time in Israel. Whereas in Job, the wicked are prospering instead of suffering, and he, a righteous man, is suffering. Third, there are those who date the book after the exile up to the 4th or 3rd century BC. The arguments to support this critical contention are as follows. First of all, number one, the extremely developed form both of the morality and doctrine of God in the book. Next, the points of contact which it presents with Jeremiah and the ideas of his age. And then the strange parallel existing between Job and the servant of the Lord in the second part of Isaiah. The objections to these contentions, however, are quickly seen. The morality and doctrine of God is no more highly developed in Job than they are before the exile. For example, the theology of Psalms and Proverbs, I believe, demonstrate this. The similarity between Jeremiah and Job come from the fact, no doubt, of Jeremiah's acquaintance, many believe, with the book of Job. Finally, the parallel between Job and the suffering servant of Yahweh is not a copied parallel, as one is the narration of national suffering, while the other of individual suffering, with the exception, in my mind, of Isaiah 53, which I take to point to Christ, an individual suffering of the Lord on the cross. It seems best then to date the composition of the book in the Solomonic era, when the works of Solomon are analyzed then and compared with Job. It seems a similarity of thought and style is seen. During the era of Solomon, the practical questions of life were being considered, and Job falls into the same cycle. Delitzsch, for example, supports this when he writes concerning the book, it bears throughout the stamp of that creative beginning period of the Chokmah, of the Solomonic age, of knowledge and art, of deeper thought, expecting revealed religion, and of intelligent progressive culture of the traditional forms of art. That unprecedented age in which the literature corresponds to the summit of glorious magnificence to which the kingdom of the promise had then attained. As to the historical background in the book, Job seems to be that of the patriarchal period. The family discussed in the prologue the extensive ownership of cattle, the offering of the sacrifice of the head or by the head of the family, and Job's age all point to this idea. Furthermore, the mention of a piece of money in Job 42:11, referred to elsewhere in patriarchal times, compared with Genesis 33:19. Excuse me. And the absence of any recognition of the law of Moses also point to a period of historical background during the time of the patriarchs. It seems, therefore, that the events recorded in the book have the patriarchal era for their historical setting. As to the purpose of the book is treating the age-old problem of why the righteous suffer. The question is treated by the example of the religious man Job in his personal affliction. How to explain these sufferings with a holy, loving God seems to be the basic problem. The first solution to this dilemma is suggested by the so-called friends of Job, who conclude that Job's suffering is the outcome of his sin. Job protests his innocence, however, and expresses his confidence that he would soon be vindicated. The next solution is suggested by Elihu, who feels that God brings suffering upon those he loves for their chastening and betterment. The final, however, and correct solution for man's suffering is answered by the Lord himself in that majestic and wisdom portion discussed at the end of Job, in which the Lord answers Job, and how this is sharply contrasted with the littleness of man. Job was taught not to question the sovereign dealings of God, but merely to rest in him, knowing that even sufferings can work together for good to them who love God and are called according to his purpose. So, in summarizing the book of Job as to its significance in dealing with the problem of suffering, Raven writes as follows: the book of Job is incomparably the most profound and dramatic presentation of this problem of suffering in all literature. Its proper solution of the question in the abstract brings it very near to the New Testament view in real life. The righteous sufferer, Job, foreshadows the righteous sufferer, Christ, and the increased blessing resulting from Job's suffering foreshadows the incalculable blessings which result from the sufferings of Christ. This view is substantiated by the statement in James 5:11. As to the basic argument or flow of thought of the book of Job, the theme of the book, as we have seen, is the problem of suffering. The book of Job then begins by introducing the readers to Job and the testing he is called upon to face in chapter 1:1 to 2:13. Job is a holy man with great prosperity. He faithfully worships the Lord. In the midst of this characterization of Job, though, the accusation of Satan before the Lord is given. He accuses Job by telling Yahweh, the Lord, that Job is only obedient because he prospers him. As a result of the accusation, the Lord permits the testing of Job at the hand of Satan. Satan, however, cannot take his life personally. Then the affliction of Job follows. His wealth and family are wiped out. His health is then taken away, and his wife turns against him. Lamentation then is a natural result as Job and his friends sit in silence for 7 days and 7 nights without uttering a word. After this introduction and background, a drama ensues between Job and his 3 friends. This is in chapter 3, 1 through 31, verse 40. 3 rounds of speeches between Job and his friends are set down, along with Job's answers and his defense of his own integrity. In the first round of speeches, Job curses the day of his birth and laments over his prolonged life. Eliphaz begins his first speech, and after complimenting Job for his good life, diplomatically hints at sin as the explanation of Job's suffering in chapter 4 through the first part of 5. He advises Job to seek the Lord for forgiveness. However, Job defends himself against Eliphaz and declares his innocence in chapter 6, lamenting about his life and concerning the character of God himself. This brings us into 7. Bildad then has his first speech and gives the same reason for Job's suffering in chapter 8. He appeals to tradition for his support. He admonishes Job to repent in order to escape further judgment. Job answers Bildad, declaring the invincibility of Yahweh and requesting a daysman to plead his case. He then concludes his speech with a bitter complaint against the Lord, even welcoming death in chapter 10. Zophar, then, the last speaker in this first round, accuses Job of iniquity. He exhorts him to repent in order to be restored and finally blessed. Job's answer, though, to Zophar are with biting sarcasm and with a denunciation of his friend's counsel. He describes the transitoriness of life and is relieved only by a faint hope of immortality in chapter 14. In the second debate, the controversy then grows more heated in chapters 15 through chapter 21. In this second speech, Eliphaz rebukes Job for his arrogance and irreverence, giving a description then of the wicked and of their fate. This is in 15. Job replies by rejecting the speech of Eliphaz and telling and falling into a very doleful lament and accusation of God for his pitiful condition. 16, 7 through 17. The second speech of Bildad follows is a strong reproach of Job and a declaration of the fate of the wicked in 18. Job answers by expressing his vexation concerning his friends and the Lord. He is vexed with the Lord over his seeming injustice, lack of mercy, and his persecution of Job. In the midst of utter despair, however, this is all in 19, a flash of victory is seen in Job as he speaks concerning a living vindicator and a living hope after death. I know that my Redeemer lives and that someday I'll see my case vindicated. It is believed that this text very beautifully points to the living Christ and also to God giving life after death, an anticipation of that by Job. Zophar's second speech is a hasty reply, stating that the prosperity of the wicked is short-lived. He applies his proposition to Job, classifying him with the wicked and their fate, and this is in 20. And then Job replies by refuting the proposition of Zophar and by rejecting his friend's counsels as pure lies in 21. The third cycle then of speeches begins and following in 22 and following with more or with intense severity. Eliphaz, in his third speech, concludes that Job is a great sinner, guilty of avarice and cruelty. After speaking piously of God's omniscience and man's wickedness, he commands Job to repent in 22. In Job's third reply, though he searches for God, proving his faith and reverence for him, he then concludes his reply by giving testimony to the prosperity of the wicked and to the Lord's apparent indifference to it. This is in 23 and 24. Bildad's speech then follows. He describes God's sovereignty and omnipotence against a description of man's sinfulness and the low estate in which Job quickly dismisses Bildad's words as applied to him and knowingly describes God's greatness. This is in chapter 25 and 26. Job then gives his closing words of self-vindication from chapter 27 through chapter 31. He affirms his innocency. He sets forth the wisdom of God and praises him for it. A beautiful text in chapter 28 about where wisdom comes from, and you can search all over for it, but it is in the fear of God. A great, wonderful text. And then Job goes on to talk about, furthermore, the humiliation and pain that he has in the present, along with God's silence in chapter 30. He ends his speech then, affirming his own righteousness and challenging God and man to disprove his claim in chapter 31. At this point, Elihu, a young man listening impatiently from the sidelines, enters and speaks in chapter 32 to 37. In his first speech, he rebukes Job for his presumptuousness and exhorts him to listen to him for wisdom in chapter 32 and 33. Furthermore, in his second speech, he refutes Job's insinuations and states that God is testing and wanting to instruct Job through affliction. And that's in 34. And then finally, in his third speech, Elihu acknowledges God's greatness, showing that affliction comes to both the righteous and the wicked. In the fourth speech, which is the climax of Elihu's, he gives the reason for suffering and an exhortation to Job in the midst of this suffering in 36. The reason for suffering is found in God's disciplining, and teaching of man to improve him. Elihu then exhorts Job to acknowledge God both in his words, first of all, and in his power, as displayed in nature and in the thunderstorm, in the snow, in the rain, and then concludes his words by emphasizing man's sinful frailty before God. This is all in chapter then 37. Following this, Elihu's speeches, following his speeches, the way is then open for the discourses of God, and this will bring the climax. In his first speech, the Lord presents, first of all, his omnipotence to Job. He is seen as creator, sovereign, and protector. He is the creator of the universe, the sea, time. He is sovereign over the deep, light, darkness, the snow, hail, lightning, the rain and ice, constellation and clouds and mist. His role then as protector is seen in his care for animals. And this is in chapters 38 going into 39. Job's only reply to this revelation is the Lord's character, as to his character, is a confession of his own worthlessness in chapter 40. In God's second discourse with Job, God's power and man's frailty are contrasted. Man's frailty, then, is depicted in his ignorance of God's creation. Only God understands the behemoth and the Leviathan. And there's been a lot of discussion as to what we're looking at in this. in these two images here. He can account, only God can account for the untamable power and strength of the ladder of Leviathan. Job's confession follows as he acknowledges God's power and wisdom, his own ignorance, his sin. Finally, he notes that the purpose of affliction is to refine man so that he can more clearly see God's greatness and his own frailty. The book then has an epilogue, as we saw the prologue and epilogue in chapter 42, in which Job's three friends are then rebuked for being wrong, and Job is restored and renewed to blessing as never before. So when we look at the book of Job, we have the prologue, the test of Job, in chapters 1 and 2 then, by way of summary. We have the suffering of the righteous, the drama, in chapters 3 to 31, and the debate with Job's three friends, we could say so-called friends. Then we have the speeches of Elihu in 32 to 37, followed then by the discourses of God in 38 and following through 42, the confession of Job then, and finally the epilogue. One thing that Job teaches us is that we cannot explain often why the righteous suffer. It is beyond the human explanation, and to blame the sufferer because of sin having been committed or something like that, the book of Job is refuting that idea. In other words, suffering cannot always be explained. It's in the hand of God, and all one can do is say, we don't know why bad things happen to good people. And so I think that's the theme of Job, and seeking to refute the traditional idea that suffering comes because of sin. The book of Job is a classic book. The Hebrew is phenomenal. It's one of the greatest books ever written. And I would encourage anyone to do a serious study of this marvelous book. Even as a literary phenomenon, it ranks number one, top, we can say. So I would just encourage the reading of this book and meditating on it for anyone that wants to be helped and challenged by what this wonderful book teaches.